Thank you, last Councillor Corla. Last August, the Minister, and thank you, Minister, for appearing. I know last week I withdrew the question because you couldn't be here, so I am very pleased to see you. Thank you. The National Association of Regional Games Councils is whom I'm really interested in and asking the question for today. 26,000 members nationwide. And last August, Minister, you announced plans to amend the open season order to remove 4 species of duck: scaup, potsherd, golden-eye and pintail duck. Comments in recent days from both yourself and the NPWS at a forum of committee that the 4 species were near extinct have been met with incredulity by many. Being amber or red around the traffic lights on the traffic light system in itself is not a sign of near extinction. In fact, at a recent meeting of the EU Task Force on the Recovery of Birds, it was decided, based on scientific assessment, that potsherd, one of the 4 species removed by yourself, should be subject to an adaptive harvest management plan. There was no proposal from the EU to ban the hunting of potsherd. In the case of another species, scaup, the EU saw no need for action as its traffic light rating was expected to improve to green. Against this backdrop, I would ask the Minister to publish the basis for the scientific evidence that the 4 species were near extinct, or else withdraw it. And during the consultation on the review of the open season order, the National Association of Regional Games Councils were invited to one meeting, which they attended. Furthermore, detailed meetings with NARC were promised, but they never happened. This goes to the key point that I'm making here today, Minister. Consultation and engagement with rural interests has been lacking, particularly when compared to the level of engagement you've had with environmental NGOs. You, Minister, you've met with NARC once, but the Minister has had only 5 times with NARC and the field sports sector, but you've met with the environmental NGOs over 50 times according to your official diary. Over the past 3 months, the NARGC have been in regular contact with the Minister's office seeking a meeting, but yet they have yet to see a response. And the pattern is replicated in the government's approach to stakeholder fora. In 2021, the review of the NPWS recommended the creation of a new advisory committee with a wide stakeholder base. The watered-down strategic action plan approved by government agreed to establish a stakeholder forum with an implementation deadline of September 2022. In response to a recent PQ, the Minister referred to the establishment of the stakeholder forum and stated an initial meeting was held in June 23 with a number of environmental NGOs, including the Irish Environmental Network. However, this week at committee, the NPWS claimed that the forum was not yet established, but the meeting last year was as a briefing for environmental NGOs. Now, it's bad enough that the forum has not been established, Minister, long after the date of September 22 deadline. But even worse when rural interests are not afforded the benefit of the briefing, which was afforded to environmental NGOs. The response to the question to the NPWS at the committee this week also suggests that the planned stakeholder forum may only be used to review the responses to the consultation on the review of wildlife legislation. This suggests only a limited role of the forum, which is very worrying. Rural interests deserve a permanent seat at the table. Separately, last year's announcement on open season order was accompanied by a commitment to establish a sustainable hunting at wild bird stakeholders forum, with a promise of being established within weeks. Nearly a year later, there still hasn't been a meeting. All of this points to a clear pattern of rural interests being excluded, while environmental NGOs seem to have a direct line to you. There needs to be parity of esteem and equal access to meetings of the for the NRGC and environmental NGOs. Indeed, I'd remind you, Minister, that NARC are one of Ireland's best and biggest wild bird conservation organisations. So I'd ask you to commit to meet NARC without any further delay and to further commit to establish the new NPWS stakeholder forum without any further delay to fully include rural interests such as NARC.
Minister.
Margaret Cairlock, and thank you, Deputy Murphy, for the question. My department is committed to consultation with relevant interested parties in relation to ongoing policy decisions on hunting and conservation. As a member of the European Union, Ireland is obliged to comply with various directives and regulations that relate to conservation and game hunting. The EU has played a very significant role in developing minimum standards for protection for certain wildlife and species and their habitats. And in the first instance, policy on conservation and game hunting is developed under the legal framework set down by EU law. In meeting these legal requirements and developing our own national policies, my department is keen to engage with all relevant stakeholders. There is a recognition that policy needs to be achievable, workable, and should strike a balance between the needs of humans and the needs of wildlife. There is an ongoing communication on a wide range of issues pertaining to the work of the National Parks and Wildlife Service. Examples include conservation schemes, a new e-licensing system for deer hunters, and the development this year of a new wild mammals open seasons order that extended the hunting season. There is also a number of structures in place to ensure communication in relation to rural interests. For instance, earlier this year, a new stakeholder forum was established, the Sustainable Hunting of Wild Birds Stakeholder Forum, as you mentioned. Mr. Teddy Cashman has been appointed as chair of this forum. The forum will facilitate discussions and collaboration across relevant sectors on the issue of sustainable hunting. All relevant stakeholders will be brought together to discuss a shared vision for sustainable hunting and to present recommendations to the Minister. A series of bilateral meetings with relevant stakeholders has commenced, and the first full forum meeting of all relevant stakeholders will take place by the end of Q3 24, and given my commitment to that. A further example of this is the National Biodiversity Forum, which comprises of 15 to 20 members, including representatives of landowners, farmers, industry, natural heritage and environmental NGOs. The role of the forum includes improving stakeholder engagement and public awareness and understanding of biodiversity. Finally, as the Deputy is aware, the National Parks and Wildlife Service of my department has commenced a review of wildlife legislation. This commenced today. And this is an extensive review, is a multi-year project, and is examining closely the effectiveness of our legislation in protecting wildlife and regulating activities that adversely impact on wildlife and biodiversity. As part of the project, my department last year held early engagement meetings with 18 of the key stakeholders. It sought their broad initial views of what aspects of our legislation were weak, what needed to be improved, what was missing, what didn't work for them. The engagement included farming groups, representatives of hunting organisations and game sports and environmental organisations. My department is committed to further meetings with national organisations with an interest in this area as the project develops and the need arises, and certainly we see the hunting sector as an important conservation doing important work for conservation too. A public consultation process, as I said, commenced today, and this will be the first of many phases of consultation, and I would encourage all interested parties to submit their views using this process and engage with the process as it develops. All submissions received will be carefully considered. In relation specifically to NARGC, I've checked back on our meeting schedule. I've met with them 4 times. I spoke at their annual conference as well. Just in relation to the stakeholder groups, because there's a bit of confusion in relation to that. So we, with MPWS officials, we host bilateral meetings with many environmental community and stakeholder groups on a lot of wide range of issues, both local and national. And a meeting was held in June 2023 with a number of environmental NGOs, including the Irish Environmental Network, an umbrella network that represents over 35 NGOs, and a number of bilateral meetings have been held in the interim. To be clear, this was not a meeting of the structured stakeholder forum, as membership in terms of reference for such a group have not been agreed. Absolutely, my door has always been open throughout my tenure as Minister, and I'm more than happy to meet with any group to discuss any issue, but there's been a lot of misinformation about the meetings that I did or didn't have with representative organisations, but I do see NARC as an important stakeholder in the conservation of wildlife.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy.
Thank you, Minister. So, Minister, thank you for the clarity, but in fact the misinformation unfortunately came from yourself. It was you who said that there had been the first meeting of stakeholder engagement. So I'm glad you've corrected the record. However, Minister, I think it's fundamental to the success of any policy that all stakeholders are included, and that you don't pick and choose to decide on the agenda, particularly an agenda that may not suit. And I think, to be fair to the National Association of Regional Game Councils, I have attended many of their functions whereby they donate thousands of euro, and they bring countries, they have this cross-border engagement with other countries such as Norway and the Nordic countries, and they come here and they actually, to my mind, it's my first introduction that they gave me to conservation, and I think they do it really well. and I can't see why anyone would be at odds with them. Now, I do think that they've taken judicial review proceedings. There's no denying that in relation to the reasoning. They've been given leave to take judicial review based on the lack of evidence you've provided to remove 4 species. That's not the forum any of us need to be in, Minister. Like yesterday, or not yesterday, maybe the day before, I watched the NPWS and I have great time for Niall O'Donoghue. The reality is that I heard him mention a number of times based on scientific evidence, but that scientific evidence hasn't been provided or doesn't correlate with the actions you've taken. So I think that's where we're gone wrong here, and I think it is imperative that the rural stakeholders have the same level of engagement as NGOs, who are primarily probably funded or in receipt of some funding. Whereas we have a voluntary organisation doing wonderful work, because I've seen it firsthand and I've seen their efforts in relation to conservation. So I don't see where we should be at odds with one another, Minister. I'm going to ask you again to ensure, when you say all stakeholders, I'd like you specifically to mention the NARGC.
Thank you, Minister.
Absolutely. As I said, my door has always been open to all organisations. We're in the depths of a biodiversity crisis, and I think it's critically important for me that all stakeholders have a role to play in this. And I absolutely recognise the important work that NARGC do and their members do, and particularly in relation to grey partridge, other species across the country. In relation to the 4 species, the evidence was there, the scientific evidence in terms of those red and amber listed species was there to warrant their removal, and I'll say no more on that, but I think that's, we have to act on these, and I have to act on these as Minister when the evidence is presented before me, and I think that's important. Separately, again, just to reiterate the point about the engagement and the stakeholder forum, and the 2 separate stakeholder processes that are taking place, and to encourage NARGC and other organisations, all organisations, to engage now in the very important process that I've initiated today, which is the review of our wildlife legislation. That's hugely important. It's up online on the Department's website today, and we would ask them to engage in that. There was a consultation with stakeholders in relation to the open season order, and I think that's important to note that too. But just in closing, just to reiterate that my department and me as Minister, as long as I'm in this office, will engage with relevant stakeholders, and I see our hunting lobby, I see our ENGOs as all having an equal say in all of this, as not many other stakeholders feel that they have a view on wildlife and nature conservation in Ireland. And I think it's very important that we keep those channels of communication open. And again, I reach out to say that to the NARGC today as well.